My name is Neil Daswani once again. I'm presenting this work on behalf of the Dascient security research team, part of which is here in the room with me. Jerry, Michael, Tufan are here with me, and but they were too embarrassed to come to the front, so they're out there. But I'll call them if I need to. The title of the talk is Mobile Malware Madness and How to Cap the Mad Hatters. So you'll see a bit of a Alice in the Wonderland type of theme when I gave internal versions of this talk and previous versions to smaller select audiences. People weren't quite sure exactly what we meant by cap the Mad Hatter. There's various interpretations of that. It could ranging from actually putting a cap on to shooting people. So there's some diagrams here which shows the latter or the former interpretation. In any case, let me go ahead and get started and tell you a little bit about what we'll be covering. I'll be talking about how the area of mobile malware has evolved over time, and then I'll be talking about two key contributions. One key contribution that we make in this work is we have prototyped a mobile drive-by attack for the Android platform. We'll be covering that, and then I'll talk about the results of a behavioral analysis study of 10,000 Android applications, which I believe is one of the largest such studies that has been publicly talked about to date. So I'll cover both of those cases and both of those contributions. And if anybody has quick clarification questions, I'm happy to answer them throughout the talk. Of course, if you have longer questions, then I'd be happy to take those questions afterwards. Let's see. Other than that, let me go ahead and get started. I'm going to start by reviewing a little bit about some of the mobile malware incidents that have occurred over the past couple years. This is by no means a comprehensive history of mobile malware and incidents, but as we know, there were incidents like Kabir conducting Bluetooth types of attacks all the way back to 2004. But we have seen an increasing level of sophistication for mobile malware. I suspect that will continue. And I'll talk about just three simple cases here. In one case that occurred earlier this year, in March of this year, there was a mobile malware sample, a mobile malware attack called Droidream, in which attackers downloaded more than 50 of the most popular applications from the Android market, Google's Android market, injected malware into them, repackaged them, uploaded them into the marketplace, and within a relatively short time period, over 250,000 people had downloaded them and run them. And these, once infected, the phones would connect to a bot master. They would attempt to take root on the device. They would send device IDs off to the bot master. So it conducted data theft in a way and sent sensitive credentials to attackers. So that's one example of an attack that's happened recently. One of the things that I should mention is that every major mobile operating system has had malware attack it. So this particular attack was against Android, but by no means is iOS and the iPhones resilient, inherently to these types of attacks. I'll talk a little bit about iKey and then talk about Zitmo as well. So iKey was a piece of malware that affected jailbroken iPhones, I think mostly in Australia. And what it had done is once it infected a phone, it would rickroll the phone and change the wallpaper to a picture of Rick Astley, as you see here, as has happened in many other types of attacks. But there were various versions of iKey. They did increasingly sophisticated things. The malware would connect to a bot master. The malware would spread to other phones in a worm-like fashion. Basically, one of the vectors that iKey took advantage of was the fact that jailbroken iPhones that were running SSH and had not changed the default password gave the attackers a great vector of way to get into the device. Now, this of course only worked on jailbroken phones, but one could imagine that in a more open platform, this could have happened, just as easily. Other advanced versions of iKey also, in addition to rickrolling phones and connecting to bot masters, turned each of the phones itself into a bot master and created a peer-to-peer botnet. So in the traditional PC world, it took a while to get to peer-to-peer botnets, but we've seen it happen pretty fast in the mobile setting. So Ikey was another interesting test case. A third interesting mobile malware type of incident that affected multiple platforms, initially Symbian, BlackBerry, Windows Mobile, and actually just within the past month, Android as well, is Zipmo. Zipmo stands for Zeus in the Mobile. So I'm sure most folks in this room are very familiar with the Zeus botnet, which has targeted financial institutions for the past few years and caused all kinds of pain with regards to stealing credentials, stealing money out of users' accounts. What Zipmo did is took the attacks to quote unquote a next level where instead of just stealing the username and password, of course many financial institutions would deploy two-factor authentication and send an SMS code to users so that stealing the username and password itself wouldn't be enough. But what Zipmo did is socially engineered a user to enter their phone number on a website and sent the users a quote unquote security certificate. Of course, the software that was being sent wasn't really a security certificate, but instead infected the phone and started logging all of the SMS credentials that were sent to the device. And so what this, of course, gave the Zeus attackers the capability to do is not just steal the username and password, but also steal the two-factor authentication code. And that's a pretty interesting, sophisticated level of attack. So these are three examples of what's happened in the area of mobile malware incidents. And there's going to be more to come. There's a whole bunch of ones that I haven't covered here. Actually, if you either come to our website or come to Black Hat's website and download the paper, we provide more examples and chronicle some of the other types of mobile malware that have hit. But we are seeing an interesting level of sophistication. So, unlike the the Mad Hatter and his accomplice in Alice in Wonderland, where the clock was frozen at 6 and they all just kept drinking the same tea. We're seeing that the attackers here are learning and they continue to get more and more sophisticated, very quickly. So that's just a couple of examples. Let me now talk a little bit about mobile Trojans versus drive-by attacks. So all of the, or I wouldn't say all, but most of the mobile malware attacks that have taken place to date have been Trojans. Applications either uploaded into popular marketplaces or other places on the web where the user is told that the application provides some piece of functionality, some gaming functionality, some financial institution functionality, whatever it happens to be. And of course, the application doesn't really do that, or in addition to providing that functionality, has malware injected and built into it. Well, if you look at what's taken place over the web over the past 5 to 6 years, we see that Trojans are not the only mechanism of distribution. On the web, drive-by downloads taking place through legitimate websites, taking place through ad networks, taking place through widgets that get infected, have become a much more primary means of distribution. And so users simply visiting legitimate websites will get infected, malware binaries will come down. Now, the question is, will that happen on mobile platforms? If it happens, when will it happen? Is it possible? So we were kind of sitting around the office at Daswani and thinking about these sorts of things and asked ourselves the question. We had seen a lot of the same components, vulnerabilities in browsers, vulnerabilities in client-side applications on mobile platforms, but we wanted to ask this question of, is it possible for drive-by downloads to happen on Androids? And is it possible to have drive-by attacks in general happen on Android? Well, it seemed like the answer should be yes, but without actually doing it, you don't really know. And so we did want to understand whether or not it was possible. I mean, if you look at other mobile platforms, if, for instance, you look at iOS, there have been drive-by types of things taking place on iOS. So for instance, for those of you that are familiar with Jailbreak Me, if you go to the Jailbreak Me site with your iOS phone, just by loading a web page on your phone, it will jailbreak your phone and pretty much unlock it. But of course, you could imagine that once you have that level of access, you could potentially do a lot more. And so, we saw that on iOS, but we hadn't necessarily seen an actual prototype on Android. So we said, okay, is it possible to take some of these existing components and put together a prototype drive-by attack for Android? Well, I should also mention that as a responsible security company, we would like to understand what the level of threat is, but we certainly don't want to advance what's taking place in the cybercriminal community in any way, shape, or form. That said, if we're thinking about it, it's probably the case that cybercriminals are also thinking about it or have thought about it already and are doing it. So we wanted to do some research here, but do it in a way so that we wouldn't advance things way well beyond where they were. So in any case, if we think about what a drive-by attack is, it's an attack where you load a web page and there should be ideally no user interaction required in order for the bad thing to occur. And if we think about the platform on Android as well as iOS, smartphones in general, they are vulnerable. For instance, both of those platforms use WebKit as a browser. As per the last talk, we've seen that there are WebKit vulnerabilities. They take some time to patch. They have interesting half-lives. And so can they be leveraged to do a drive-by attack? Well, the answer is yes, and I'll show a demo of such an attack in just a second. But before I do that, let me just review how our team did it. Well, basically, the team looked at two vulnerabilities and prototyped a drive-by attack where just by loading a page in a browser, the attacker is able to steal all of the instant messaging conversations that are stored in the Skype user database. And so there's two key vulnerabilities that were used in this drive-by attack. To an extent, you could say it was actually a drive-by upload as opposed to a drive-by download. But step one was user visits a compromised page. The compromised page takes advantage of an existing WebKit vulnerability. Once this particular WebKit vulnerability takes advantage of an issue in how WebKit processes floating point numbers and conducts a appropriate heap spray, but once that's complete, gets the device to connect to the attacker's server, and the attacker can then upload files, issue commands of choice, and so in the third step of the attack, the attacker uploaded the Skype user database, because due to this other existing vulnerability, all the files that were being stored by Skype were world readable as opposed to just readable to the user, and was able to then read those conversations. So let me go ahead and show the actual demo of the attack. So I have a few components here on the screen. On the right-hand side is an Android emulator in which we're going to load a web page. We're going to type in infectedpage.com or infectedsite.com. And on the left side, there's two windows. The top window is a window that just shows the attacker's web server log so that we can see a file getting served with the appropriate exploit in it. And then in the bottom window is the attacker's window where the attacker, after the compromise has taken place, is going to upload the Skype user database and list out the conversations. And so what we're going to see is that the page will get loaded and we'll be able to read the message from the Skype database. So when we go ahead and hit play, I'll talk through it, and then we'll highlight particular things. The text isn't as large as we might like it to be, but you should be able to get the basic idea. So on the right-hand side of the screen, we're going to enter a URL, infectedsite.com. The page is going to get loaded. It's pretty much just a blank page. We see the web server spit out logs that say it served the exploit, and it served the page with the exploit on it. A connection gets made back out to the attacker's site. The main.db file from Skype gets downloaded. uploaded to the attacker server, and the attacker issues a command which says, please read the database, and the username is Joe Smith, and it says, this is a secret message because Skype uses the encryptions. So basically, we're able to, just by having the user load a web page, read all of their Skype IM conversations. So that exemplifies that drive-by attacks are possible on the Android platform. Let's see. Oh, question. Actually, yeah, that's a good question. So the question is, OK, in this case, we read conversation from Skype. What else can we do? Pretty much, we could have done anything else, too. We could have taken root. We could have uploaded exploit or Rage Against the Cage, whatever, taken root on the device, and just have complete ownership. So that's a very good point. It's basically the path in, and it's kind of game over from there. Great. OK, so we covered contribution number 1. Android is susceptible to drive-bys, which may or may not be surprising, but definitely doable. So I think that given that we've seen mobile Trojans and that in the future we may see mobile drive-by attacks, I think it's important to spend more time looking at how to mitigate mobile malware. And so in this work, we're talking about some preliminary work and preliminary research we did over a weekend just for fun. Let me just talk a little bit about different approaches that could be used. I had mentioned that our second key contribution in this work is going to be the results of a behavioral analysis of 10,000 Android applications. Now, of course, behavioral analysis is not the only technique out there for doing malware analysis. There's a number of different techniques, ranging from signature checking, in which you are doing pretty much string matching, more or less. There's so the idea there is that if there is a known piece of malware and you want to be able to detect it, you find a unique string of size M, and you look through some set of code of size N, and you don't actually run the code, but you look through the code in an efficient way. And so Boyer-Moore-Horspool is an example of such a signature checking algorithm. A second mechanism that you can do to analyze both good as well as malicious Android applications or any type of applications is static analysis. And you can imagine that in a static analysis, you might want to decompile an Android package. You might want to analyze the bytecode. You might want to analyze potential control flows, reconstruct them from the constructs inside the program, and or do some kind of pattern matching. Look at things in the code, look at the permissions, the application requests, and come up with interesting data about what an application might do to figure out its characteristics. A third mechanism to analyze an application is to conduct behavioral analysis, or it's also referred to as dynamic analysis, where it differs from the previous two is that in signature checking, you don't really have to have any understanding of the code at all. You pretty much look at the code in a very black box kind of way. You just look at the bytes pretty much and look for matches. In static analysis, you are still looking at the code, but doing more detailed looking at the code and what it looks like. In behavioral analysis, you're taking effectively the next step. We're not just looking at the code itself, but you're looking at what the code does by actually running the application, usually in some kind of highly instrumented emulation environment. And so that's exactly what we did in our behavioral analysis. So that's what behavioral analysis is. We look at what the code actually does as opposed to what it looks like. And you can imagine that some of the things that we're going to be looking for are what's taking place in the network traffic, what's taking place with SMS traffic, what system calls is the application making, what API calls might it be making, etc. So those are the three different approaches. Now, as you can imagine, there's quite a few different pros and cons and trade-offs between these approaches. One of the things that I should mention is that it's not the case that one of these approaches or another one of these approaches is the holy grail or anything like this, but I think that it's important to take a hybrid approach to fighting malware, both on mobile and or other platforms, and or even if you just want to get an understanding of what an application does, even if it's legitimate, you can use these multiple techniques. So to just talk a little bit about some of the pros and cons. If we look at signature checking, one of the big pros about it is that it's relatively inexpensive, right? Its performance is usually proportional order n or order mn. It's very good at detecting known malware if you have a good signature. Of course, some of the challenges with it is that as the size of your database of signatures grows, as the size of the application grows, it becomes more and more inefficient. And so what we've seen on PC-based platforms with malware is that traditional antivirus checkers that just rely on signature checking alone, and most antivirus packages don't just do signature checking, they very often do something else too. And we're going to see continued innovation there, but we've seen that on PCs, the efficiency of the algorithms are now becoming even more constraining, just given the number of malware samples that are out there, and that the applications are getting larger and larger. The other con is that while signature checking is very good at detecting known malware, the signature checking might not be able to identify variants. And so you might want to rely on other types of approaches to identify variants. The attackers are known to, and I'm sure it's very, this is kind of like 101 for this particular community, but it's always good to have everybody on the same page, right? The attackers will come up with new variants, they'll run it through all the existing antivirus detection tools, they will determine which ones are not caught by signature checks or heuristics and deploy those. So as a result, it's important to also use static analysis and behavioral analysis in our repertoire. Static analysis is also relatively inexpensive. One interesting thing about it is that it can be used to guide behavioral analysis. There's probably more that I could talk about there. One of the downsides of static analysis, though, is that if you have an application and you do static analysis on it, that static analysis might tell you that the application has linked in a library that allows it to send SMSs. That's interesting to know. There might even be some hard-coded SMS numbers inside that application. But one question is, will it actually, what does it do when you run it? Will it actually send something to that SMS number, and how many will it send? So static analysis, while it can help detect potential capabilities, it very often might not help detect the actual capabilities of any particular application. With behavioral analysis, when you actually run the application, it can help you detect those actual capabilities. Of course, there's a certain set of things that you might need to do to poke or prod the application into doing all the behavior, but that's that's something that can be addressed. One of the nice potential capabilities of behavioral analysis is that because of the fact that you're not just relying on signature checks, so long as you can prod the application into showing the appropriate behavior, it can help you detect potentially unknown malware, and do so at a very low false positive rate because of the fact that once you see the application actually do the bad thing, it's a very strong signal. It's hard to get that wrong. On the other hand, behavioral analysis can be much more expensive in terms of CPU resources, in terms of network bandwidth resources, because you're actually running the application. It can also be subject to various anti-reversing techniques. Attackers that write malware may check whether or not there's a using red pills, check whether or not they're running within an emulated environment, and may decide not to exhibit the malicious behavior so that it can foil behavioral analysis. So there's a lot of interesting pros and cons here. And I think the real question is, how do we take advantage of the best of the strengths of all these approaches in a consolidated way? So I talked about behavioral analysis. I talked about some examples. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the details here. So I mentioned earlier that behavioral analysis can uncover things that static analysis can't. For instance, if you look at the code of an application, you might see certain IPs in there, you might see certain domains in there, but you don't know, what access pattern is it going to use? How often is it going to access those domains? What data is it going to send to those domains? In addition, even though a application might link in a library that allows it to access the contact address book, there's questions like, well, when you actually run it, how many entries in the address book will it access? And so behavioral analysis can answer those kinds of questions. One thing that I should chat briefly about is how do you address the cons, right? It's very expensive to run this behavioral analysis. You can imagine that if you wanted to do heavyweight behavioral analysis on an actual phone on a client, it may significantly bog it down because of the fact that the device may not have a lot of resources. So one thing that you can do to mitigate that expense is to quote unquote leverage the power of the cloud, right? Ship the application and or some hash of it off to a server, have that server run the expensive behavioral analysis and get back to the client with a result. That's one way to address the cons. Another concern is, well, how do you deal with anti-reversing? And the quick answer there, although one could probably give a full talk about it, is that you can, if you're, say, running it within a emulated instrumented environment, you can harden that emulated instrumented environment. So if you look at the Windows world, some malware might check what the VGA driver is. And if it says that it's the VMware VGA driver, then of course the malware is not going to do the bad thing. And there's of course similar things that one can do with mobile emulators. Now, I should mention that thus far, we haven't seen a lot of mobile malware that does checking as to whether or not it runs in emulators, but it's going to come. So it's going to be really important. So it's going to be important not only to harden the environments that one uses to do behavioral analysis, but it'll also be important to run samples on actual devices, on a device farm when necessary. There's various products built for PC-based malware analysis that support those kinds of things, and I think there's a lot of open green fields with regards to this in the mobile world. So now that I've chatted a little bit about behavioral analysis and static analysis and signature checking and the different trade-offs between them, I wanted to mention some high-level principles for mobile malware detection, given all of those pros and cons, and given those trade-offs. I think that mobile malware will continue to get more sophisticated, and thus far a lot of approaches being used have been based on signature checking and or static analysis. I think we're going to have to employ more and more behavioral analysis as the malware gets more sophisticated. We've seen that with DroidDream, for instance. There are now more variants of DroidDream than existed before, and that's going to continue. With regards to using a combination of approaches, I think that it's going to be important to have clients leverage the cloud and take advantage of data and doing a lot of analysis. In any case, I'm not going to spend too much more time, but one could imagine a scenario where you have a behavioral analysis engine in the cloud actually also auto-generating signatures that get sent out to antivirus clients on mobile devices to keep the checking and mitigation efficient. But in any case, I've talked a lot about principles. What I want to do now is jump into some of the results of the behavioral analysis study that we did on the 10,000 Android applications. So to just chat a little bit about the data set that we used, we pulled these 10,000 Android applications off of the Google Android Marketplace, and we chose them from 30 different categories on the marketplace to get a good broad mix of different sorts of applications. When we did the behavioral analysis, we simulated some user interaction, but not a lot, although we could have done more. We actually started seeing interesting results just with the limited user interaction, so we figured we'd do that first, and we may do more in the future. Some of the things that we studied and some of the results that we found is that many applications were conducting what some would feel are privacy violations by leaking IMEI and IMSI numbers, so I'll talk a little bit about some of our results there. I'll also talk about results from the analysis of network access, traffic patterns, bandwidth, SMS activity, and system call activity. So let's start with Imei leakage. So out of the 10,000 applications when they were run in our behavioral analysis test bed, we found that 842 of them sent off the user's IMEI number, which is their International Mobile Device Identifier, to a remote server. And there's different levels of this, but there's some number of applications that, so by the way, I should mention that all of these applications did ask the user, hey, can I access the IMEI number? Or can I access the IMSI number? Of course, we know that when it comes to making security decisions, users very often don't do the best job and just click yes to everything. So I think while that kind of permission asking is good, we also should look at things beyond that. Another thing that I should mention is that a user may provide access to access an IMEI number and may provide access to allow the application to access the internet, and the user may have different use cases in mind, but pretty much once those two permissions are given, they can of course be combined, and some users would be surprised with how applications take advantage of permissions in combination. So looking at the set of applications that requested IMEI numbers, so out of a subset of the samples, there were a number of applications that requested the IMEI number but didn't send them off to a remote server, or at least we didn't see the behavior based on the limited analysis that we did. A number of them actually sent out the IMEI in the clear, just the bits. There were a few applications that attempted to compute an MD5 or a SHA-1 or a SHA-256 hash of the IMEI number before sending it out. Now, a couple of high-level points. With regards to these IMEIs being leaked, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to find that result just by using static analysis, and/or static analysis may have yielded quote-unquote false positives because they didn't actually see the behavior. We found that a number of the applications leaked not only IMEI, but approximately 60 of the applications also leaked the IMSI, and the IMSI number is the number that's kind of burned onto SIM cards, and so and IMSIs were always sent in the clear for some reason. But in terms of implications, just some of the high-level implications are that with a IMEI number getting sent off to a remote server, the device could be cloned. An IMSI number getting sent off could result in somebody cloning a SIM card and potentially charging phone calls to that user, so that's not good. And then even if those exact threats were not completely possible, there's still just a privacy issue with regards to an application provider being able to study the user's behavior, understand how long have they used a particular device across time. If multiple application providers get together, then they could correlate behavior across your applications, which might not always be nice. So in any case, result number one is leakage of these various IDs. Based on those results, there's a couple recommendations that we have for Android developers. So if an application developer needs a unique ID for a user, the IMEI or the IMSI might be very convenient, but it's not as privacy preserving as, for instance, making a connection off to the server and just asking the server for a random user ID. At most, the developer might have to keep track of some state so that they don't give out the same IDs twice, but this way you have a number that's completely divorced from the device itself and from the user. And that way it allows you to retain state but doesn't have privacy issues. Another thing that one could attempt to do is, instead of just taking a hash of the IMEI or the IMSI number, one could salt the hash, add in some additional randomness and entropy. That can provide more privacy, but you need to store the salt on the device. You need to make sure that an adversary can't predict the salt. There's issues there. One thing about using IDs like the IMEI and IMSI number is that if the user ever starts using a new device, then the application developer loses track of that user. So there might be some some good reasons to use a application layer ID like the user's email address, so that even when the user switches phones, and I think, I don't know, users switch phones every 18 months or so, it probably has some correlation to contracts. That's another app layer ID. One final recommendation with regards to the sensitivity of the information here is that in many of the cases, it wasn't the application developer themselves and their own code that was sending the IMEI and IMSI numbers off to remote servers. They used a third-party library for analytics so that they could understand what was the user's behavior, or an ad network so that they could monetize their application. And these third-party libraries are the ones that sent off these IDs. So one thing that's important for Android developers to do is to look at the third-party libraries and look at what they're doing, and then make a decision as to whether or not that third-party library is as privacy-preserving as the application developer would want it to be. So those are some recommendations based on finding number one. Another finding is that we looked at the network behavior of these 10,000 applications, and we looked at what domains they were accessing. And so one of the interesting things in this graph, and on the y-axis of the graph, we have the different domains accessed. On the x-axis of the graph, we have the number of samples that connected to these domains. We see some interesting stats. So if we look at the results, we see that the most popular ad networks being used on for mobile applications are AdMob, DoubleClick, Google, AdWhirl, and MobClicks. And the most popular analytics packages were Flurry and Google Analytics. Just an interesting piece of data that we can get by looking at the behavior. Another behavior that we looked at was system call activity. So one of the interesting things about the Android platform is that if you look at other operating systems, you can derive a lot of information about an application by looking at the system calls, because there's typically very fine-grained system calls. Of course, the way that the Android platform is implemented is that the base system calls at the Linux level are fairly coarse-grained, and the functionality is in the Android APIs, and that's much more finer-grained. So in this particular graph, we've shown what are the different system calls that were accessed. What we can see is that because things are coarse-grained, it was kind of hard to get a very deep idea of what was the application behavior just from these high-level system calls. So for instance, reads and writes ranked very high. But the interesting thing to look at here is reads and writes to what, right? For instance, if there was a write taking place to a socket or to a file descriptor that corresponds to the SMS daemon, that's pretty interesting. So in any case, this quick analysis revealed that, for doing malware analysis and or other detailed analysis, it's really important to look at the API calls at a higher level, and or look at specifically what file descriptors and other detailed arguments were being passed to these system calls. We looked at bandwidth usage. So in terms of behavioral analysis, I think one of the great things is it can be used to identify malware. And I'll talk about some behavioral signals that were used to identify malware. But the other nice things that come out of it is that you can find privacy violations. You can find also performance violations. You could imagine that a mobile operator might be glad that there's a lot of different applications getting released on the platform. It'll create all kind of engagement with users, but there might be some applications that are just going to abuse the bandwidth. And if a lot of users have unlimited rate plans, then it's going to hurt the operator. So if we look at this particular graph is a log scale graph of the bandwidth usage for the 10,000 applications that we behaviorally analyzed. And I'll just comment on two things. Number one, you see most of the applications at the bottom of the graph didn't use a lot of bandwidth, which is a very good thing. especially given that we didn't poke and prod them very deeply for this quick analysis. But if you look at the top, there were some anomalous applications. There were a couple data points. If you look at the topmost one, this was a maps application that when you first run it, it starts downloading tons of images and data, and in fact, I wouldn't be surprised if when it does this, it's just unresponsive to the user. So, this particular application, what the behavioral analysis reveals is that it could have probably been architected in a better way. So that's some results on bandwidth usage. Finally, let me talk a little bit about interesting behavioral signals for mobile malware detection. So, behavioral analysis is a very interesting beast, and one can imagine that when putting together a mobile malware detection system based on behavioral signals, one might be interested in having hundreds of interesting signals. Of course, I didn't have the time to talk about hundreds of signals, and there's also some reasons that you wouldn't want to disclose all of these, kind of like you wouldn't want to disclose click fraud signals, or you wouldn't want to disclose other sorts of signals. But let me just go ahead and talk about two examples. So when Droid Dream was behaviorally analyzed by our system, we saw that it generated a lot of processes. So one example of a behavioral signal that may indicate that a application is malware or just plain old not being well behaved is the number of processes it starts. If you look at the emulation environment that we had set up, before we run the application and behaviorally analyzed it, there were typically, on average, 58 processes running on the emulator, with a standard deviation of 4.5. So not a lot of processes. Now, on the other hand, when you run a sample application that's been infected with the Droid Dream and runs the Rage Against the Cage exploit, in which it creates a whole bunch of processes. All of these processes initially start off with a high level of privilege, but are supposed to drop down in privilege pretty much right away. And that happens actually, in all the cases except when there's a corner case and there's too many processes running on the device, and then it doesn't drop down. And so that's how Rage Against the Cage works as an exploit. So as a result of that, we saw on average 660 processes started with a standard deviation of 238. The interesting thing about this is that even if you look at the average number of processes for Droid Dream and take 2 or 3 standard deviations below that, it still doesn't touch the baseline very closely. So that makes it a very good signal for behaviorally detecting malware. A second example of a behavioral signal is an undesired or unexpected SMS activity. Mobile Trojans have been monetizing themselves in various ways. One of the ways that they've been monetizing is the attacker sets up a premium SMS number for themselves and gets paid every time a infected device sends SMSs to that number. And so, if you look at a number of the different samples listed here, the behavioral analysis reveals that there's a number of different messages sent. The fake player examples sent 3 or 4, and they basically hit a particular set of SMS numbers. There's also this last sample. This last sample was the walk-in text mobile malware sample, which the attackers created a pirated version of it. This was kind of a hacktivist attack, where what it would do is once it infected the device, or once it ran on the device, basically, it would send a message to all of the user's friends telling them that they were too cheap to pay for the real version of the application and that they're using the pirated version of the application. So, the analysis reveals that of course occurs. So, in any case, there's a lot of, these types of signals that would get revealed through behavioral analysis that wouldn't always be possible through other means. To show and wrap up with 2 examples. One example of an application that actually conducted one of the privacy violations that we mentioned is on this slide. The name of the application, a number of the fields have been grayed out to protect the innocent. But you could see that the reason that our system flagged this as a privacy violation is because of the fact that it made a HTTP GET request to a server in Japan, that contained a hashed version of the user's IMEI number. Bad news. It also accessed a bunch of other domains and requested some permissions, but you get the idea there. If we look at an example of, say the bowling time application, the bowling time game, which was one of the 50 or so that got infected by Droid Dream, we'll see that it revealed a number of other behavioral signals. One of them was an attempt to take root access via the Rage Against the Cage exploit. A second was direct access to the bot master IP listed there. The game, of course, went on to access its images from Akamai and pull in ads from AdsMob, as well as from AdsWorld, but you get the idea. So in any case, that's a result of the analysis for Droid Dream. So to wrap up, we have talked about quite a few things. We've seen a growth in mobile malware in the past 2 years, especially in the first half of 2011. Most of these things have been Trojans so far. We think mobile Trojans will, of course, continue. The question is how the attacker is going to get further distribution. Mobile drive-by attacks might be one option for them. We prototyped that and saw it work. We saw that behavioral analysis can complement signature checking to identify mobile malware, as well as just understand privacy violations and performance violations. We studied 10,000 Android applications and came up with some interesting results. There's, one thing I should note is that this particular study is just the tip of the iceberg. We're doing a lot of interesting things at Dascient as a company. We have provided web anti-malware services to some of the leading enterprises on the web. We have provided anti-malvertising services to some of the largest ad networks. We've employed behavioral analysis for these sorts of things in the past. I think this is an interesting start of some preliminary research on using behavioral analysis to identify mobile malware. And with that, I look forward to working together with the community to advance the state of the art here. We are hiring at Dascient. If you're interested in these sorts of things, drop us an email at careers@dascient.com. Beyond that, I want to just close with a comment. I don't know how many folks have heard of Alice in Wonderland syndrome. It's also called Todd syndrome. It's a syndrome where children and teens are sometimes, it's hard for them to see or to understand the sizes and proportions of things for a variety of reasons. And since it's still fairly early in the mobile malware space, it's going to be interesting to see, there's been a lot of reports out there with regards to mobile malware growing by 400% in the first half of this year. That was a report from Juniper. It looks like things could get pretty bad here because of the fact that mobile devices are going to be used more and more so for commerce and payments, and we have seen these upticks. I think it'll be interesting to see whether or not there's some Alice in Wonderland syndrome taking place here. My guess is probably not, but I think it's really important to be prepared. If we want to learn from the lessons of what happened in the malware worlds on PCs, now is the time to start acting so that we can have a more safe, more secure, open environment for mobile applications. Beyond that, I hope you guys had a great time here at the Black Hat Conference. I hope you have a great time at some of the parties tonight as well as at DEF CON. We'll be around to answer any quick questions, but just wanted to say thanks for your time.